Well, after Valentine's Day, I thought it would be kind of fitting to talk about how to wreck your marriage. And today we're going to look at that. How to wreck your marriage. Isn't that a good conversation to have after Valentine's Day? If you didn't celebrate your precious spouse, you're probably on your way to wrecking your marriage. If you're not married, take some notes, because sometimes when we learn how not to do something, it'll keep us from doing something. Isn't it right? You know, it's amazing that our society, sin never gets better, it gets worse. You know, first they come up with, I remember back in the, I don't know, might have been in the 80s, it came up with, Police Academy 1. And here it is, a place where guys are training to be policemen, and they show all the smuck that goes on at the parties, And then it comes up with 1, 2, 3, and 4 and each version was probably, not that I've seen it, but, a little bit worse, a little bit louder, a little bit worse. And sin never gets better. It gets worse, doesn't it? Unless we deal with it. And our society is the way we continue to go in sin, the worse it's going to get. Movies come out that are just showing, just terrible things about our society. And they try to take things that should be wholesome and they make it bad. Even television, some of the reality shows, it starts with, the housewives of Atlanta or the housewives of whatever city it may be. And they show these, it's supposed to be housewives are supposed to be, of the 50s, taking care of their husband and wife. Well, these girls, they wear these clothes that, you can't even afford, and they live a lifestyle that we can't afford, and they're saying this is normal for housewives. And basically what they do is they show all the smuck of their lives, thinking that this is just normal housewives, and they show all the, not that I've watched it, but you see enough on, and now they're television stars. They're celebrities. And then now there's even a program that I saw an advertisement for pastors' wives. And they take these pastors. I don't know where these pastor wives got their dresses, but my wife can't afford those kind of dresses, and they show them all dressed up in glamour, and then they show behind the scenes, Now, I haven't seen it because I don't even want to see it, but it intrigued me of maybe seeing it because it was like, but all it's going to do is show the bad side of what should be good, what should be upstanding and more. And somehow that pulls our attention into watching some of that stuff. And then we get into, there was just, what is it, redneck party something camp, where, I don't know. It's just like, it starts off things get worse and worse and worse, and all of a sudden one works. And so now they have all these party scenes of, from redneck to housewives. I don't know. It's just, our society just continues to be scarred by all kinds of things. And a lot of them are not wholesome, and they're really not there to edify. They're really there to tear apart. And we get a view of society that it looks a certain way. There was an elderly couple that was approaching their golden wedding anniversary. And they'd been 50 years that they'd been together, but it was anything but happy. Each day of their marriage had been scarred by arguments and misery. He blamed her, and she blamed him for all the trouble. Neither was willing to change their mind, and the other one was waiting for the other one to change their mind first, and they stood on those principles. The couple's children threw a 50th wedding anniversary, a big, huge party for them, and after the guests left the house, it was quiet. The wife spoke to her husband in a calm voice and said, "We've lived together for 50 years, and neither one of us have lifted a finger to make the other person happy. We fought every day. Now, I really think it's time to change, don't you?" And her husband could hardly believe his ears. And then she said, "I've been praying that things would change for us. It has become so bad that I'm even asking the Lord to take one of us home to heaven. And when he answers my prayer, I'm going to sell the house and move in with my sister." She was unwilling to change. How about you? Sometimes we can be so right we're wrong. We just have to be right. And sometimes it doesn't matter the situation. You can be right. But if we're so right sometimes, we stand on that, all of a sudden it's our ego, it's our pride, and really it's all wrong because we put our rightness in front of the other person. It's interesting in scriptures we find many dysfunctional marriages also. and it can really teach us how not to act. And we're going to look at that today as we look at the book of Esther, and we're starting in Esther, a series in Esther's, and we're going to see such a case with Xerxes and Vashti in the first chapter of Esther. If you would just turn there, if you have your Bibles in the Old Testament. The story of Esther opens with an account of a lavish party. Now, we've seen, the party scenes on television, but they had nothing on the Old Testament party. And in verses 3 through 4, it says that the King Xerxes gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. It lasted for 180 days, 6 months, a 6-month party. And he wanted to show the wealth of his kingdom and the splendor of all his glory and majesty. And the guests were public officials who would come and attend. And it was all the hobnobs of that society that would come over and party with him. And they stayed for as long as they could, and then they left. There was only one person that stayed for the whole time, and that was the King Xerxes himself. Probably the official who showed up, they showed up for a week, and then they'd get tired of feasting at the party, and then they would probably just go and leave, and the next wave of people that would come in. And there'd be always things to eat, things to drink, and he just wanted to display how important he really was. But the issue is that to him, this was what life was all about. Life was all about. He just wanted to show himself off. The following 6-month party, we expect Xerxes to collapse from exhaustion, but not him. He then throws another 7-day party, and he gave another banquet lasting that 7-day, a week long, for just anybody who wanted to come. Every citizen of the capital city was invited. And just to be able to say to them that he wanted the lower lives to see how important he was too. But he could only spend about a week with them. And the king held no luxury from his party. And you ask, well, where was the king's wife at all this time? He doesn't mention, but in verse 9, it says Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal place. Now, this is the third banquet, the third party mentioned in the first 9 verses of the book of Esther. So both Xerxes and Vashti were engrossed in worldly pleasure. They both were. They were consumed by themselves. And it's interesting that I believe that we too, like the king and the queen, our society has an incredible appetite for pleasure. I mean, it's all over the television about how we can be consumers of our own pleasures. We spend hundreds of billions of dollars each year on movies and video rentals and hobbies and recreation and vacations. Americans spent $350 billion each year on gambling, including state lotteries. $350 billion. In the United States in 1915, 10% of all income was spent on luxuries. By 1980, a figure had risen to 30% of our income is spent on luxuries. It's even higher today. I don't know what the exact percentage is today. This isn't to say that all pleasures are sinful. Many have a legitimate place in our life, even as a Christian. There's nothing wrong with enjoying a well-deserved vacation or a game of golf or going out for dinner together. And there's a place for even recreation in our lives. And I believe in recreation, there's also restoration, a time of rest, a time of peace, a time of restoring. It relieves stress and things like that. So there's not a sin in the area of being able to take some time and enjoying it and being able to have some pleasures. But here's where sin enters in. It enters into the picture when we make an idol out of our pleasures by loving them more than you love God. So many people in the cities would live for the weekends, and they would have, I had a brother-in-law that had motorcycles, he had racing sailboats, he had ski boats. I mean, he had a barn full of all these toys, and man, when it hit the weekend, he was gone. I mean, that was his church, and he was away, and if he would never be home. He worked hard, but he got all his toys stored up, and that's what he did. That was his religion, was his toys, and he had it all. I just named a handful of all that he had. And I was a little jealous seeing him have all those things, but that's what he lived for, and that was his church, that was his God. He claimed to be a Christian, but he sure loved it. You never saw him in church on Sunday. He was out. God was a winter sport for him. When he couldn't do anything else in winter, he'd come to church. But the deception thing about worldly pleasures is that the satisfaction is just short-lived, and we can never seem to get enough. That new computer we bought is, by the time we bought it, it's already outdated, and it maybe lasts 3 years and it's throwaway. And we buy that new car, and all of a sudden it gets old, and after a few months, everything we have, we seem to just take it for granted because it's not new anymore. In Ecclesiastes 5:10, it warns us. It says, "Whoever loves money never has money enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with his income." There's never enough. There's always more. There's always more. Satisfaction really comes in a relationship with God, knowing that he's the source of our satisfaction. He's the source of where we find our life, and our content comes from him. There was a very famous writer, a world-renowned writer called Ernest Hemingway, and he enjoyed the high life of all that Hollywood had to offer, and he traveled around the world. He had a place in Paris and all over. He hunted big game in Africa and grizzly bears in Northwest in the United States. He flew to Spain to attend weekend bullfights. He had the life of a life that everyone aspired to be. He had it all. In 1954, he won a Nobel Peace Prize, but 7 years later, he blew his head off, took his life, committed suicide. And his final piece of writing was a suicide note that he said, "Life is one darn," he said something else, "life is one darn thing after another." After everything he had, the last thing he writes is life is just one darn thing after another. There was no satisfaction, and he had it all, but there was no satisfaction. Matthew 6:33 is such a promise to us that it says that if we seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, then everything else will be added unto you. That means if we put our importance in God and in his kingdom, everything else will be added unto you. It means that we don't need to neglect God for sports or entertainment or our hobbies. We don't need to neglect God in our marriages. We don't need to neglect God in relationships. It's that we put God first in those, and then everything else, God would supply our needs. And then in those things, in our marriage, in our relationships, come joy and become a real meaning. Well, how do we become dysfunctional? How do we wreck our marriage? The second point I want to say is when we treat our spouse as an object rather than a person. To treat our spouse as an object rather than a person. The trouble with today in a lot of marriages is that you see, as what we saw with the king and queen, is that they're married singles. For 6 months, he had no connection with his wife, and all of a sudden he calls upon her. They were married singles. So many times we see even in Christians that they're both married and they're all about their kids and they're going in all different directions. But all of a sudden, what happened to the two becoming one? Kids and work and everything else came in that all of a sudden they're married singles. They're not come as one. It's a battle to keep our marriage connected as one. It just doesn't automatically happen. It takes hard work for us. And if we treat our spouse as an object rather than a person, it so easily happens. In verses 10 and 12, we see that King Xerxes is full of wine, and he sends the eunuchs out to bring him the queen. And wearing her royal crown, she was ordered to come in and display herself before the nobles. And she was very lovely, it says, but the Queen Vashti refused to come. Xerxes wanted to show off the beauty of his wife in the same way he displayed all his other riches that he was showing at that time, all his kingdom. He wanted to show all his prized possessions, and he really wanted to show now Vashti. Even her name is meaning the desirable one. And he wanted to be able to display her in his stag party that was going on. He wanted to say, in a sense, wouldn't you love to have one of these? Well, I do, and she's all mine, folks. But Vashti refused to cooperate. In a sense, she was right to disobey her husband. I think that she had every right. It says that in some of the commentaries that the order was for Vashti to just appear wearing the crown and display herself wearing nothing else. It's almost as if women today, and we fall into the trap, and a lot of young women that are dating, the guy wants her to take a selfie, and a naked selfie or something that's in this skimpy little outfit. And then this guy takes it and he shows it around to all of his buddies. And girls today don't have any dignity. Well, at least Vashti had a point of being able to say, I have dignity, and I'm not going to parade myself naked in front of all these guys at your party. I'm not going to do it. That got the king mad. Her modesty made the king very angry. And Xerxes had all of a sudden had more love for himself at this point than he really did for his wife. And he let his pride and his ego become more angered, and anger to arise in him that it was a rage that he was on a prowl, because his wish wasn't going to be granted. To him, it was just like a trophy that he had shot this big rack buck on the wall, and he wanted to take it out and show the crowd. It was an object of sexual pleasure. And that sometimes we fall into the same trap as when we consider our wives to be an object of maybe just sexual pleasure, or a cook, or a house cleaner, or a babysitter, a partner in business. And our wives are guilty when they treat their husband as just bill payers, or money machines, or security blankets, or a status symbol, a security blanket around them so they can just live the way they want to live. They're married singles. The other one just provides a service, but they're not united as one. You know, God uses us in a way very personal for spiritual purposes. But what happens in these situations is that people use each other in demeaning ways for selfish purposes. A sure way of wrecking our marriage is to treat our spouse as an object rather than the person. A third dysfunction we find here, a way to just wreck our marriages, is letting our anger control us. In verse 12, it says that the king became furious and he burned with anger. You can just see him, slamming his wine jug down on the table, and spitting out wine in disbelief and getting all red and upset. In his mind, it was treason. It embarrassed him. It challenged his pride and his ego. His own temper enslaved him at this moment. He was a volcano waiting to blow its stack, and he wanted to release his wrath upon his wife. And he did, and it seared their marriage. In Colossians 3:19, it says to men that are like Xerxes, it says, husbands, love your wife and do not be harsh with them. The right temperature at the home is to maintain a warm heart, not a hot head. And so many of us go in and we don't get our way, and we demand what is right. And in our righteousness that we think we're so right doing, we're really wrong in our doing. There was this place out in China that men and women can relieve their frustrations, and it was called the Sun the Rising Sun Anger Release Bar. And this bar employees were 20 men in protective gear, and they were behind the bar, and the patrons can take glass and break it out and throw it, and they would hit this thing, the screen, and they could throw eggs, they could throw glass, they could throw it, and these guys are trying to serve them at the same time thinking it was called the Rage Bar. I don't know, it's weird, it's in China. You know, sometimes we rant and we rave when we got to release, and so there was this place that they're releasing it there. But here's the key. Here's the key. If we get teed off because our spouse disagrees with us, it really tells the truth about ourselves. It really, at times, things fail to measure up to our own preconceived image of how things should be, how our wife should be, how our husband should be. And so we get this built-up anger, and all of a sudden it unleashes a sinful anger within us. Genuine strength shows us self-control. It refuses to wear our feelings out on our sleeves. And it's a willingness trying to understand our partner's view and what they're thinking, and takes time to understand that and be able to talk through it. And once we have a time of understanding maybe about how the other person is viewing it, sometimes it helps us understand that we may be talking about the same concept, but we're looking at it at a different angle. I always like to take a milk carton and you hold it up, and we're all looking at the same item, but I'm seeing something totally different. I may be seeing directions and what the context is where you're seeing who it's made from, but it's still all, you know, a bottle, right? And so sometimes we look at things at different angles, but all I can see is my angle, and I can't see what you're looking at. It's all the same truth, but we're looking at it different ways. And when we get our anger involved in it, all of a sudden it becomes a sinful rage in our lives, and it just wrecks marriages. Husbands who flaunt their authority with an anger spirit, and wives who maybe nurse unspoken feelings of bitterness towards their husbands, it sabotages their marriage. They're never able to get down and talk about what's really important and be able to have a plain field, to just be able to come and just talk through some of the areas that they need to talk through. Immaturity plagues our marriages today because we're just too selfish, self-centered, and we have to be right. It's a dysfunction. The fourth dysfunction that we wreck our marriages is we declare our egos as sacred. We declare our egos as sacred. We see in verses 10, 12, and 15 that Xerxes issued a command to his wife, and he was a king. His ego was sacred, and no one, not even the queen, could question it. It's the same way as a lot of times a man, we feel our home is our castle, and what I say goes, and if you don't like it, then move out. And there is truth to, we are a leader in our home. We're a spiritual leader in our homes. We're a spiritual leader. We're not a king. We're not an authoritative dictator. We're there to be a spiritual leader, a one who brings healing. And Jesus said, if you want to be great among my kingdom, learn to be a servant of all. We need to learn how to serve in our home and to be a servant leader, not one who takes it as a dictator. A major source of conflict in marriages today is the unwillingness of the other person to sacrifice their egos and put the other person more important than themselves. I was fishing with Howard McHenry once in a fishing hole at a trout derby, and he was fishing in this hot hole. And so I came up and started fishing next to him, and he turned to me and said, hey, there's only room for one of us, so why don't you leave so I can fish in my hole? Move over. I didn't say that quite right how I wanted to get out, but sometimes we get looking and we go to a situation and all we can see is that there's only room for me. There's no room for anyone else. Move over. There'd be more room for me if you would get out of the situation. And, that's how we really look at life sometimes. There's more room for me if I just get rid of this person that's in my way. And sometimes that's your husband, that's your wife. Plato once said, it says, for a man to conquer himself is the first and noblest of all victories. Isn't it true? Because we live in a me generation. For men who say, do my laundry, get my dinner on the table as soon as possible, don't spend so much money, make sure the house is clean when I get home. Even if it's not in a stern voice, it's still demeaning, and it commands them to serve in a demeaning way. Xerxes declared their egos as sacred. And a lot of times as we declare our egos sacred, our marriages are unmerited. We've got to work on that. The fifth and the last dysfunction, how to wreck our marriage, is listen to the advice of godless people. And here's the big issue that came in the defiance. You see in verses 13 through 15, King Xerxes sought for advice. He was so mad, but he searched it from the wrong person. It's amazing to me when I talk to sometimes married couples and they get advice to go ahead and get divorced. I said, well, who did you talk to? Well, the couple who's been divorced 2 or 3 times. It's kind of like, well, what kind of advice is that from? Why don't you seek someone who has, maybe some godly advice, maybe a marriage that is whole, and see how they've kept it whole. And here Xerxes go to these wise men that there were actually astrologers, and they were getting counsel from guys that were into the horoscope for guidance and to the stars. And Xerxes cultivated friends that were not godly. They were considered wise men as the world looked at them, but they weren't wise at all. They didn't have any God in them and any virtues that God would have in them. And then the Memucan was a sorcerer, and the king, bruised ego, went to him for advice. And he claimed that Vesti had done wrong against the king, against all the nobles. And it says here that these men were having trouble with their wives, and they felt that, boy, if the queen's wife would give the king trouble, everyone's watching what he's going to do with the queen, and we might have a revolt with all these women coming unglued with us. We got to nip this in the bud. They were more concerned about their own statelyhood than they really were about the king. And if Vashti got away with this, they were all in big trouble. And so they set it up, and it was sad to see them set it up. And the ultimate came from the law that was given, that the Memucan came and gave in 19 and 20. He says, therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed. They were making a law that could not be broken, that the king would issue an edict and proclaim throughout the kingdom that women will respect their husbands. And he was advising Xerxes to divorce his wife, and she won't come to you when she's called, then don't let her ever come again, ever again. And that will teach all the women a lesson. And the sad part is that the king and the nobles sat around, thought that this was great advice. And in verse 21 and 22, they issued that creed that every man should be ruler over his own household. Personal relationships cannot be legislated in the home. I've seen a lot of men take the Bible and says, women are to be silent. I'm to be the man of the home, and you're to be subjected to me. You are to submit to me. And they look at all one-sided instead of looking at the scriptures that say, man is to love his wife as Christ loved the church. He gave his life. Both are submitting to the other person. God gave his life for the church. And men, we got to give our lives for our wives. And that's putting them more important than ourselves. We just want the women to submit. Well, both of them are submitting to each other in a healthy marriage. We need to get rid of the egomaniacs that we tend to like to be. Xerxes became this egomaniac, and all these guys thought they'd have it all together. I believe that the king, if you look in this next chapter, that the king lived to regret his reactionary decision. It doesn't give word for that, but you can kind of pick it up. And as I read the commentaries, it kind of saying that after he made that harsh judgment, he was sorry. How many marriages end up divorced, and years later, if they knew what they had to go through, they probably wouldn't have done it because of the pain and the suffering that takes place. Many couples face severe crises in their marriage. Perhaps one partner has committed adultery or addicted to drugs or alcohol or gambling. They're hard issues to go through. And when the innocent spouse seeks advice, a lot of times the friends tell them, get rid of the guy or get rid of the gal, or they right away go to a conclusion without saying, why not seeking the Lord first in that, see what the Lord may have. In the 30 years of ministry, I probably on one hand, I can't count how many times that I thought that there should really be divorce involved. Work through the issues, work through the hardships, and in that, let God have a testimony in that. Sometimes there isn't, and it breaks my heart. But most of the times, it's just ego, pride, making mistakes that need to be mended and healed, and let God have a testimony and walk in a work in that marriage, and he can. And sometimes we see people jump to even, not even marriage to marriage. They just go to partner, and all of a sudden that commitment and the realness of a marriage and that coming together and the bonding of the two becoming one and the mystery of the marriage and the wholeness is lost because it's just been watered down so much. Can we glorify and allow God's grace to come? Or are we going to allow a tarnish of his glory in the solutions that we seek in our marriage relationships? Seek the Lord. Marriages are going to be challenged. Relationships are going to be challenged. Trust God to change that stubborn spouse. Be real to be able to take your own issues and lay them down and become a servant heart to your spouse and putting them more important and learning to cherish them even though it's undeserved honor, to sometimes honor your spouse, to honor that partner. When we allow God to really work in the midst of our relationships, then we can see him get the greatest testimony out of them, the greatest strengths. Our world is broken. Our society is broken. And they need to see wholesome marriages. And marriages, when I say wholesome, that you work through the differences. You work through the ways that sometimes if we get offended at something that is a bad mistake and a wrong choice, you have to work through those and allow the healing to come. And sometimes when a husband or something like that is, let me say a biggie, gets caught in pornography on the computer, and all of a sudden it's like, I want to go right to divorce, or I'm cutting him off from everything, and that is a terrible sin to do. But in that sin, if there's repentance that has taken place, and the wife gives a grace and honors her husband, and when he doesn't deserve it, and comes to that place of healing, that marriage can actually get stronger in that, and their relationship can come stronger instead of it being just another division. And not that it's right, because it's totally wrong. But sometimes if we allow God's grace to come in, you can be the healing agent in that person's life. Something's going on that their life isn't right in their relationship with God, that they have to go to drugs, alcohol, whatever that vice may be. And in our marriage relationships, if we're really honest, we can try to meet each other's needs in that place and be real with one another. Man, it's hard in our society to live holy, to be what God wants us to be a holy priesthood set apart for his service. And if we get a mindset that we're set apart to live this life together to serve our God and King, then all of a sudden we're not serving ourselves, we're not serving our ego, we're serving a God together. And when we're serving a God together, he gives us purpose and meaning and value in life. We're never going to get value from the world. We're never going to get value from the pleasures that they try to throw. Satan tries to trick us and say, man, this is what life is all about. Just seek this pleasure. It's all, go to the party thing, the housewives, back to the TV things. That's where they say where all the happiness is. It's not there, gang. It's in a committed relationship to our God, to our families, to our spouse, and to each other. What is the image of yourself? What is it that you carry about the image of yourself in your heart? All of us think of ourselves a certain way. What image, let me ask you this, do you even know what image you may project to other people that you work with, to other people that see you? How do they project your image of who you are? Have you ever asked your wife, do you think I'm a godly man? Do you think is that what I portray to others at work? Have you asked your wife, or your wife has asked your husband, do you see me as a godly woman, and do you see me in the workplace and in my family holding up to the values of being a godly woman? That's a dangerous question. That's a very vulnerable question to ask your spouse. Wow, that's hard. What is the image you project in your marriage, in relationships that you have if you're not married, in your workplace, at school, with your family? How are other people perceiving you? Well, I don't care what other people think. That's a terrible. As Christians, we should care, because I want people to see Christ in me. In my imperfections, in my stumbling, in my not saying everything right and doing everything, I still want people to see Christ in me, the hope of glory. Do you even have a desire to project the image of God? Do you have a desire to project an image that would please our Father, to please your Father? In James 4, 5, and 6, let's look at some scriptures, and we're going to close with these three scriptures. James 4, 5, and 6. I'm going to read a couple of these together as soon as they get up on the screen. I had to wake them up back there. James 4, 5, and 6, if you've got it. Is it, or do you think, Scripture says without reason, that he is jealous long? Okay, that's okay. In verse 6, can you get 5 and 6 up there together? But he gives us more grace. That is why Scripture says, God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. What is being prevailed in your life? Is it more of your being prideful, or do you show others a humbleness of your life? Who do you associate with in your life? Proverbs 23, verses 6 and 7. Proverbs 23, verses 6 and 7. Says, do not eat the food of begrudging a host. Do not crave his delicacies. For he is the kind of person who will always be thinking about the cost. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you. Who do you hang out with that really are they're just into their own lives. They're in their own world. And sometimes you seek advice from them when there's no godly trace. There's no, they're not after a godly life. Oh, they may have money. They may be able to give you things and to buy your friendship. But really it's at a cost because it's not real. They'll throw you aside in a hot minute. Romans 12:3. Romans 12:3. For by grace given me, I'll say to every one of you, do not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourselves with a sober judgment and according with the faith God has distributed to each one of us. Putting others more important than yourself is really the key to Christianity, isn't it? It's a key to relationships. It's a key to marriage, to put others more important than yourself. That's the agape love. The agape love is putting others more important than yourself, to love them without any conditions on it. You know, when you honor somebody, you honor them and put them as honoring in your life, not because of sometimes it's because you work for that person, so they're an authority over you. So you honor them by respecting them. It's not, I'm going to respect people who respect me. It's no, I respect people because an officer who's a policeman, I'm going to respect them because of the position they have. A doctor, I respect them. Why? It's because of the position that they hold. I respect the office in which they hold. And so in society, we've lost, and I'm going to go in a whole series of that, respecting those who are in authority. We have this attitude in America, I'm only going to respect those who respect me, and if you don't respect me, I don't care if you're a policeman or not. I'm going to do my own. We've lost honor. We've lost honor in the church of honoring those who are elders and pastors, and we just don't honor people anymore in society. We don't honor our teachers. I mean, when I was a kid, a teacher would call home, or I'd get a call from home, and they would tell on me, and I would get so mad because I'd go get whooped on. Because, well, what about my side? It didn't matter my side of the story. If a teacher called home, I got whooped, and I got some whoopings. And I always thought that was unfair, but my parents honored the authority at the school. And you know what? I deserved it. If it wasn't that, it was something else that I didn't get caught on, okay? I didn't think at the time I deserved it. But there was an honoring. I was raised in a home that honored the authorities that was there. And it used to make me mad as a kid, But there was honor. But it taught me when I worked for a place, even in high school, that I honored the authorities that were there. I didn't have to agree with them, but I honored the authority that was there. And while I was there, I honored that. We've lost that today, folks. This isn't even part of my sermon. But I'm just saying, if we can't learn honor, to honor our spouses, to honor the relationships in which we have, children honoring their parents. Oh, boy, here we go. There's a lot of things that we need to learn in our day that we've lost in our culture. But more to that to come. Let's all stand together. Hi, I'm Pastor John McConnell, and I'd like to welcome you today for watching our program. It's just amazing the technology we have today that we're able to live stream all around the world. And we'd like to give you an opportunity, if you'd like to give towards this ministry, you can go online and be able to follow the directions that are on there and be able to give to the ministry that you've been watching. So God bless you. We thank you for being part of Southside Alliance Church today.